Good afternoon. Aloha. Thank you for coming. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker. This is Professor Patrick Kirch. Professor Kirch actually started his career here at Bishop Museum when he was just 13 years old. He grew up here in Honolulu and came to the museum to volunteer in the malacology department and later in the anthropology department. He then went on to get lots of degrees, got his PhD at Yale in 1975, and he returned to the Bishop Museum, came back home, and worked for nearly a decade here at the museum before he moved on to Seattle, firstly, and then to Berkeley, where he's been for nearly the last 25 years. He's a professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley. So without further ado, Professor Kirch.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you, Mara, for that introduction. It's true, I started here as this little geeky guy at 13 in the snail department. And I did work here at Bishop for a long time, and you're going to see this afternoon some of the fruits of the research we did. I hope you've had a chance to see the new exhibit, Pacific Hall, or you will later. I got to see it on Thursday night for the first time, and it was quite an interesting experience to stand in front of this case, there's a case called Hawaiʻi, and see objects, fish hooks and adzes and pottery that I dug up out of the ground 30 years ago. And now I see them in this exhibit case, and it's a very interesting experience, because I have a history with those objects. But it's wonderful to see the new exhibit, and that archaeology, which has been such an important part of this museum, has a very prominent place now in the permanent exhibits. What I want to do today, see if this, Mara, it's not advancing. Oh, it's the bottom one, not the middle one. Okay, I'm going to try and do three things in the course of the next 45 minutes or so. I want to give you a little history about archaeology in the Pacific, especially with reference to Bishop Museum, so you understand sort of how our knowledge about the past has developed over the years. And then I want to give you the kind of big picture of what we now think about the settlement of the Pacific over 40,000 years of time. And then because we are here in Hawaii and there have been some interesting debates about when people got to Hawaii, I want to end with some discussion of that. Because the dates of initial Polynesian arrival and settlement in Hawaii have been changing according to recent archaeological evidence. A lot of people ask me, so in your book, Feathered Gods and Fish Hooks, you say AD 300, but now you're saying AD 1000. What's going on? So I'll try to explain what's going on. Okay, so let's start with a little history. Well, when Captain Cook and other Europeans sailed into the Pacific, and we see textbooks, Captain Cook discovered the Hawaiian Islands. Of course, he didn't discover them; the Polynesians discovered them. He was a Johnny-come-lately. But with the European voyages, we began to get some of the original speculations, if you will, about how did these people get out here. The Cook and others were amazed. Because these islands that were in the middle of the Pacific, and they get there, every island they get to, there are Polynesians already ahead of them. And so Cook was one of the people who, he wrote and he thought a lot about this. And this is just one quote you can read of his speculations. But he realized that certainly the Polynesian people were all related, especially because they spoke related languages. I mean, he learned some Tahitian, made 3 trips to Tahiti. When he got to Hawaii on his 3rd voyage, they immediately recognized what he said, the sounds of O-Tahitian speech in the Hawaiian language. So he knew they were related, but he didn't know how. How was it that people had gotten out to these islands long before Europeans? Jump ahead 100 years or so into the later 19th century, and this gentleman, who has some connection as well to Bishop Museum, Abraham Fornander, was a Scandinavian man who came to the Hawaiian Islands, married a Hawaiian woman from Molokai, learned to speak Hawaiian, and he worked with some of the important Hawaiian scholars of the 19th century, Samuel Kamakau in particular. Fornander actually hired Kamakau to collect and write down the mo'olelo, the traditions of Hawaii. He compiled this in his very important book, An Account of the Polynesian Race, which has sort of been forgotten today, but it's worth going back to Fornander actually and looking at what he said. And he used then the genealogies of the chiefly line and so on to try to estimate when people came to Hawaii and other Polynesian islands. And he thought, as he says here, it was about maybe 800 or 900 years earlier. But there was no direct archaeological evidence for this. Archaeology, as a field, doesn't really get going until the founding of the Bishop Museum. It's plays a very important role in the history of archaeology in the Pacific. Not long after the museum was founded, in the early 1920s, archaeology begins to play a very important part of Bishop Museum research, especially these famous Bear Dominic expeditions in the period 1920-21. There was a wealthy Yale graduate, Bear Dominic, gave the then princely sum of $40,000 through Yale to Bishop Museum to fund these expeditions. It's probably equivalent of $4 million today. And the museum sent out expeditions to several of the Polynesian islands. This gentleman, some of you in the audience may have known him. I knew him very well. Kenneth Emery was the leading archaeologist here at Bishop Museum for over half a century. But here he is as a young man, about 20, probably 23, 24 years old, in the crater of Haleakala, doing some of the first archaeological excavations. One of the Bear Dominic expeditions went to Tonga and was headed up by W.C. McKern. He was a young anthropologist the museum brought in to do this. And this was very typical of this time period in archaeology in the Pacific. McKern goes to Tonga. He spends probably 6 months there at least. And he sees these stone monuments like the famous Ha'amonga Maui on Tongatabu and these big burial tombs of the Tongan kings. And he maps all of these things and so on. And he tries to dig. Most of us, when we think of archaeology today, we think of digging, of excavation, finding things. But at this time period, there were a lot of assumptions that it wasn't worth digging in Polynesia. They thought they wouldn't find anything important. McKern did try to dig. He put some trenches into what he called a kitchen midden in Tonga, and he found pottery, decorated pottery. Now, the Tongans weren't known to have ever made pottery, so this was an interesting find. But he had no way to date it. He didn't know how old it was. So he thought, well, the Fijians next door to Tonga, so to speak, they made pottery, so it must just be some late Fijian pottery that came in here to Tonga, maybe a couple hundred years old. He actually had found the first lapita pottery in Tonga. Now we know that site is like 3,000 years old, but McKern had no way to know this. Te Rangihiroa, or otherwise known as Peter Bucks, or Peter Buck, was of course the director here at the Bishop Museum for several decades. And during this period that I'm talking about, where archaeology was mostly restricted to mapping of surface sites and so on, Te Rangihiroa became the leading anthropologist of Polynesia. He was not an archaeologist. He was an ethnologist. He studied the contemporary cultures, but he tried to use all that evidence to create a theory about where the Polynesians had come from and how. And his theory, sorry, it's a kind of a gungy scan there, but you can see the Pacific map. This is from his book, and the lines kind of trace the migrations. And Te Rangihiroa said, well, the Polynesian ancestors, they came out from Asia at some point. He thought they came through Micronesia and then got into Tahiti and then dispersed to the rest of Polynesia. He didn't really want to have the Polynesians associated with Melanesia, I think really because of the racist implications. Te Rangihiroa himself suffered a great deal of racism against him. He actually wanted to become a U.S. citizen at one point, and he was denied it because of the Asian exclusion laws of the time in the U.S. I write about this in my book, On the Road of the Winds. In any case, and that's his famous book, Vikings of the Sunrise, still worth reading. So within Polynesia, Te Rangihiroa had Tahiti, the old name for which was Hawaiʻi, as the center of dispersal for the Polynesian region. I love his image of the octopus with the tentacles radiating out to all the points of Polynesia. The big change, which really brought archaeology from being a minor discipline of just mapping surface sites to be a discipline that is the core of Pacific anthropology, had to do with the development of radiocarbon dating. This was in the late 1940s. Willard Libby, who'd been on the Manhattan Project, creating the atomic bomb, one of the byproducts of an atomic explosion is actually radioactive carbon, so he got researching on this. But then Libby realized all living things have radioactive carbon, but it decays at a constant rate. So if we can measure that and the ratio of radioactive to stable carbon, we have a tool for dating. It was this light bulb went off in his head. He won the Nobel Prize for this, actually, for his development of radiocarbon dating. And this just changed everything all over the world for archaeology, but especially in the Pacific. And so back to Kenneth Emery. You saw him there when he was like 23. Now he's, I guess, in his early 50s probably. He's been at Bishop Museum for a couple of decades, and he begins to dig, to excavate here on Oahu. First at this famous site of Kuli'o'o, and he hears about Libby's discovery of radiocarbon dating, and he says, you know, I got to get one of those radiocarbon dates. And so he sends off charcoal to Libby in Chicago, and he gets the first radiocarbon date from anywhere in the Pacific Islands. And I love some of these quotes, one from Bob Krause's biography of Kenneth. When he gets the radiocarbon date, AD 1004, he says, boy, was I excited. You know, it just immediately opened up this whole realm of possibilities. And when Emery and Sonoto published the Oahu Excavations monograph at Bishop Museum, they put that date next to an ads you see right there on the cover of the monograph. At the same time that Emery was beginning to dig in Hawaii, other archaeologists started to get re-interested in the Pacific, one of them being Edward Gifford, who was my predecessor at Berkeley. Gifford had been on the Bear Dominic expedition to Tonga, Bishop Museum's expedition in 1920, along with McKern, doing the ethnography. And now Gifford, he was in his 60s, he said, maybe we should go back and do some real digging in the Pacific. So he went to Fiji in 1947, and then in 52, he went to the island of New Caledonia, where he found this kind of pottery at a site called Lapita. And I'll talk more about Lapita in a few minutes. But we now know that Lapita, the Lapita culture was ancestral to not only the Polynesians, but many of the cultures through Melanesia and Micronesia. So at the same time Emery's digging, Gifford is making these discoveries. And, of course, Emery is continuing his Hawaii work, and I have to bring in here now, ahead of myself, this gentleman. We recognize Yoshi Sonoto. I know many of you know him, the senior archaeologist here at Bishop Museum. I think he just celebrated his 90th birthday or is about to. So here he is in 1954. It's a funny story about Sonoto. He was actually on a boat from Japan to Berkeley. He was going to go to Berkeley to pursue graduate school in archaeology in 1954. And Emery heard about this bright young Japanese archaeologist on the boat, and he went down to the dock in Honolulu, and he found Sonoto, and he said, you have to stay and work with me. He literally got him off the boat, and Yoshi never left, right? He eventually brought his wife, Kazuko, and little Aki Sonoto, who's become an archaeologist as well. So together, Emery and Sonoto really advanced archaeology in Hawaii. Around the same time, Robert Suggs, in the mid-1950s, went to the Marquesas Islands. There had also been a Bear Dominic expedition there from the Bishop Museum in 1920. A guy named Ralph Linton had led that. He had just decided it wasn't worth digging in the Marquesas in 1920. There's nothing in the ground, he says. There's no pottery. Everything rots. The soils are acidic. Well, Suggs goes there in the 50s, and he finds at this site of Ha'atuatua, in this sand dune, fish hooks, adzes, all kinds of stuff just eroding out of the ground. Rich, rich material, including pieces of pottery, a few pieces of pottery, that then link back to those finds that Gifford was making in Fiji and New Caledonia. Yoshi Sonoto then followed up on Suggs's pioneering work in the early 60s. Suggs kind of dropped out of things. He actually went to work for the CIA, which is interesting. He said it paid better than being an archaeologist. But Yoshi then goes to the Marquesas, finds the site of Hane, very, very important site, and you'll see artifacts from Hane in Pacific Hall and pictures of the excavations. And it is here at Hane that the initial radiocarbon dates suggested Polynesian settlement around AD 300 to 600. As you'll see later, again, those dates are now being revised more recently in time, for reasons I'll explain. And this led then to, around the late 60s, early 70s, a model, a theory of Polynesian dispersals. It was something like Te Rangihiroa's. You know, he had the octopus, but they sort of put time lines on the octopus's legs, if you will, turn them into these arrows, and saying initial settlement of Tonga Samoa about 1000 BC, then to the Marquesas about 300 AD, radiation initially out from the Marquesas and including to Tahiti, and then secondary migrations from Tahiti up to Hawaii and down to New Zealand and so on. This became the kind of standard model of Polynesian dispersals according to actual archaeological evidence and radiocarbon dating in the 1970s and 80s. Another fellow in this history that I cannot ignore, the late Roger Green. He also worked here for a period at Bishop Museum, and he was one of my mentors along with Kenneth and Yoshi. Roger did important work in Samoa archaeologically, but Roger was the one who also said we can use other kinds of evidence along with archaeology, and one of those is the evidence of linguistics, which was developing strongly at this time period. And Roger used the branching patterns of the family tree of Polynesian languages to produce a kind of model of Polynesian settlement, but he put it on a time scale that was developed from archaeology and the radiocarbon dating. So he's putting the language and the archaeology together. And again, in Pacific Hall, you'll see that. It's part of the new exhibition, and there's a wonderful interactive map where you can go, and I don't know if any of you played with it yet, but you can push the buttons for words like I, mata, and you'll see it all the way across the Pacific. All the Pacific languages have some versions of mata for I, or niu for coconut, or so on. And then, this is my last slide on the history section. The other very important contribution that Roger Green made, along with others, was to show that this Lapita culture, which had first been found by Gifford, but that it really was directly ancestral to the early Polynesians. And Roger did excavations in the eastern Solomon Islands as part of a Bishop Museum project in the 1970s. This is one of the potsherds he dug up with this amazing face design on it. And he showed that the sites in the Santa Cruz Islands were just slightly earlier than those in Samoa and Tonga, and it began to trace Lapita back along that route of migration back toward Asia. Okay, so that's a little bit of history. I thought it was important to show you how things have developed over time from when, back in the 20s and 30s, archaeology was basically a very unimportant discipline, and that people thought there was no way to date anything, and just map Heiau and Marae, to with the development of radiocarbon dating and excavation and how our knowledge has accumulated over the decades. Now let me try to summarize in the middle section of this talk the current sort of picture of the settlement of the Pacific. And we often use these terms now in talking about Pacific settlement, near Oceania and remote Oceania, and you'll see these in the Pacific Hall display. Near Oceania is the area here of New Guinea and the adjacent Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon Islands. It's near in the sense it was near to Asia, which is the ultimate source area that people are coming out of. And this area, we now know, has been settled by humans for at least 40,000 years. All right, 40,000 years. Remote Oceania, which is basically everything else out here, including Hawaii, where we are, did not get settled by humans until the last 4,000 years. All right? And I'll show you why that's the case. So we have real difference between near Oceania, long, deep history of settlement, and remote Oceania, which is like a big burst of human exploration and settlement across the Pacific. Looking for a minute at near Oceania, 40,000 years ago, the whole landscape was entirely different. Sea levels were lowered during what we call the Pleistocene, the last glacial age, and so New Guinea here was connected to Australia by dry land, Tasmania was connected, and vast parts of island Southeast Asia, where there's a shallow continental shelf, they were also dry land. So early modern humans expanding out of Africa basically could walk Africa down through Asia and here almost to Australia and New Guinea, but there was always a gap. Whoops, excuse me. These buttons are tricky. Okay, there was always a water gap in here. It's referred to sometimes as Wallacea after the famous biologist Alfred Wallace. There were always water gaps there. So early humans coming into Oceania, near Oceania, had to have some kind of watercraft. It's too far to swim, and somebody years ago said, oh, well, maybe it was one pregnant wahine with twins, a boy and a girl she was carrying, and she floated across on a log. I don't think so. I think they had some kind of watercraft to get out there to near Oceania. And it might have been something like this. People in this region still do make simple rafts of bamboo, natural flotation devices. You don't need sophisticated technology to take down some bamboo, get some lianas in the forest, lash them together, and make a pretty good raft. I don't think it was dugout canoes because we have no evidence of them having the stone technology to cut dugout canoes at this time period. So it's more likely something like this. Whatever they used, they got, I keep doing that. They got across to New Guinea and Australia, probably on two different routes where there are stepping stone, it's mostly intervisible islands that they could sail across and get into. One of the oldest sites, perhaps the oldest site that we have in near Oceania on the island of New Guinea on the north coast of the Huon Peninsula is here where the shoreline is being pushed up by tectonic forces. What happened when the ice ages ended, end of the last glacial, 10,000 years ago, sea level rose dramatically by 120 feet, drowning all the coastline. So it's very hard for archaeologists to actually find coastal sites where people would have lived that date to that time period. But here at the Huon, the shorelines are being pushed up all the time. So these are old raised reefs that you see like stair steps. And on one of these, my colleague Les Grube in New Guinea has found lots of these big, he calls them wasted blades, big kind of split cobble axes. They're very crude. They're not ground. They're just split. But they were wasted or chipped to make a waste here, almost certainly to lash them to some kind of stick to make a crude sort of axe. What the heck they were doing with these things at 40,000 years ago, we don't know. We honestly haven't got a clue. But they're certainly artifacts, there's no question about that. We learned a lot more about this early period in the 1980s with something called the Lapita Homeland Project that focused on the Bismarck Archipelago. And several rock shelter sites on the island of New Ireland were excavated at that time. This is one of them, Matim Kupkum. It's a simple rock shelter in a limestone cliff here. And it had archaeological deposits that went back, you can see, 36,000 years ago. Before that, we had no idea that out there in New Ireland, New Britain, people were there that long ago. Too many buttons and things here. These are some of the objects from Matim Kupkum. The technology was very, very simple. They didn't make nice polished stone adzes like the later Polynesians. They didn't have fancy fish hooks, any of that kind of thing. Very simple, expedient flake tools in chert and other hard rocks. Just bash off a flake, get a sharp edge. But probably they had a sophisticated technology in wood and fiber, and they may have done matting and netting, and that stuff has not preserved, unfortunately. Maybe someday we'll find a wet site where such materials exist. But these sites do contain a lot of faunal material. In this case, these are turbo and other shells collected and eaten by these people 36,000 years ago. So they were already exploiting the resources of the sea, of the lagoons, and hunting in the inlands. But they were hunters and gatherers. They weren't agriculturalists. They didn't have the taro and yams and other crops that came later. This is another site in New Ireland, Panakiwuk, a little bit later in time. It dates to about 15,000 years ago. And I wanted to show you this because here, in the cross-section of the excavation, anybody recognize what this bunch of rocks and ash in a pit is? Here in Hawaii, you guys ought to know what that is. It's an imu, right? An earth oven. This is the oldest earth oven known anywhere in Oceania. It dates to about 10,000 years ago. So the origins of the kind of oceanic cooking that we think of, the earth oven, go back at least 10,000 years in in near Oceania. Okay. Those were just a few slides to illustrate this long 40,000 year period, about which unfortunately we know all too little still because the remains are so simple. At about 4,000 BC, we get the next great big stage in the story of Pacific settlement. And this is the stage that would lead to the settlement of all of remote Oceania. This was the expansion of a group of people who spoke what we call the Austronesian languages. The Austronesian language family, which includes all the Polynesian languages, is the most widely spread in the world, actually. There's about 1,200 modern languages. everything from the Rapa Nui language of Easter Island, the Maori of Aotearoa, Hawaiian language, all the Polynesian languages in between, the languages of island Melanesia, the Philippine languages, Indonesian, and even the language Malagasy of Madagascar are all Austronesian languages. They're all related. They have diversified over time, over about 5,000 to 6,000 years. Note that the languages of New Guinea are not colored there. They are the languages that descend from those people who moved in there 40,000 years ago, the Pleistocene hunters and gatherers. They speak Papuan languages. There are about 950 of those. They're completely different from Austronesian. They're unrelated. They would be distantly related to the languages of Australia here. But this great diaspora of the Austronesian speaking peoples, when we pick up the train in the oceanic area, I'm not going to talk about Southeast Asia or Madagascar, that would be too long, but in the Pacific, we pick it up archaeologically with this thing we call lapita. I've mentioned the term already. Lapita is first and foremost marked by this very distinctive pottery, highly decorated, elaborate pottery. And sites with this kind of pottery are now known, lots of them, over 100, probably 150 sites, distributed from the Bismarck Archipelago off New Guinea all the way through the Solomons, down the Santa Cruz group, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, that's where Gifford first found the site of Lapita in 1952, through Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, as well as Wallis and Futuna. These Lapita sites appear quite rapidly over about a 500-year period. The oldest are up here in Musau, and the youngest are out here in Tonga and Samoa. So we have a kind of rapid trail marking the expansion of these Austronesian, early Austronesian speakers making this pottery, beginning about 1500 and by about 900 BC arriving in Tonga. I did a lot of work on Lapita in the 1980s up in the Bismarck Archipelago in an area called Musau, and you will see some of that in the Pacific Hall exhibition, some replicas of some of the objects I found and so on. Beautiful group of islands, Musau Islands. The discoveries that we made there in 1985 to 88 were pretty remarkable. And one of them, we actually found this site, Talepake Malai. It is what we call a wet site. It's waterlogged, much like Sinoto's Vaitotia on the island of Huahine. And because it's constantly wet, it preserves organic materials anaerobically. So when we were digging down in 1985, and, whoops, I keep doing that, sorry. This upper part of the deposit is dry. But when you hit right about here, you see the color change. All of this is underwater. So my hoses were pumping water out. And these things that you see, these black objects, are the preserved bases of posts of stilt houses that once stood over a lagoon. We had no idea until we found this, that Lapita people lived on these kind of stilt houses. And I found this, I was really blown away. This kind of a house we're talking about here. And we could directly radiocarbon date those post bases, and they are indeed back to about 1500 BC. Here you can see the excavation in progress. There's kind of standing water, and we're pumping out. And when people were living on, imagine this stilt house here, pottery was dropping off, objects were dropping off, they were throwing things off. So all of this material accumulated in what would have been the sort of tidal waters under the stilt house. And the preservation was superb. So here was, for example, almost a whole Lapita dish. It had broken into pieces, but they were all lying there where we could then, put them back together. We recovered more than 60,000 sherds, pot sherds from this excavation, and some of it is really quite amazing. A lot of it has human face designs. And this is one of the things in the Lapita culture that we can then see the later traces out into Polynesian cultures, the emphasis on faces in bark cloth or in carving or in tattooing. They're reflected early on in the Lapita pottery. I don't know how good the slide shows up for you, but there's a face here that's an eye, long nose. And this guy's got, they sort of start as the face, but they end up coming out as upraised arms, and they have digits, fingers on the ends. And it has some amazing little two-headed creatures that may have been tattoo designs on the cheeks. And then you can see another face down below. This piece, Again, really remarkable. There's the photo and then a rollout drawing by my artist. It was a big cylinder stand about this high, probably supported another pottery vessel. Objects would have been used in ceremonies of various kinds. This is ritual material, not every day, you eat out of this thing. We call this a cylinder stand. And again, you see the face there with some kind of flame headdress, but it's actually within another stylized face, because this is another stylized eye and a big face that would have been another one there. So we have face within face. And we can speculate about what this may have meant, but it could have, again, had to do with ancestors, with the progression of chiefship. It may be representing the son, firstborn son of the chief. We don't know for sure, but it's interesting to kind of speculate what these may have represented. And then this little object, which there is a replica in Pacific Hall, came up in that site of Talepakimalai. It's just about 5 inches long. Carved out of the bone of a porpoise, the sea mammal. Again, much like the pottery, eyes, nose representation. I think it was actually set with those little legs into a wooden staff, a sort of wand that may have been used by a priest, perhaps representing a sea god. I'll tell you a little story about it. We were excavating. I was in one pit, and one of my Musau Island workers was next to me. Bawa Sagila was his name. And he actually exposed this thing. He's a very good digger. He was very carefully troweling it off. He knew I wanted to plot it in position and so on, so he didn't pick it up at first. We mapped it in place and all that. And I said, okay, now, Bawa, why don't you pick it up? It was lying face down, so we knew it was shaped. We didn't know what it was. He picked this thing up. He turned it over. The face, for the first time in 3,500 years, saw sunlight. And Bawa conjured back, and he said in Melanesian Pidgin, God belong wo lapita. It's the lapita god. It's really quite amazing. And the lapita culture was much more than just pottery. The material culture is very, very rich, and again, presages the kind of material culture we get in later Polynesian sites. A very elaborate, sophisticated shell working, all kinds of ornaments, beads, exchange valuables. There's a beautiful little pendant here. It's fish-shaped. There were shark teeth drilled. My wife kept wanting to get them for earrings. I said, no, you can't. Those are archaeological specimens. Fish hooks, which of course become very important later in Polynesia and so on. Okay, so that's lapita. It's very important in the whole settlement story of the Pacific. It represents this rapid movement of people out into remote Oceania all the way to Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. So let's talk about that area for a minute. Watching my time, I think I'm okay. In Tonga, we pick up this lapita trail, something we call Eastern lapita. The pottery begins to be a little bit simpler, not so elaborate as the earlier lapita, but they're still making a range of vessels here. In 1976, when I was still working here at the Bishop Museum, we led an expedition to the island of Niutoputapu, and you will see objects in the exhibit from this site, the site of Lolokoka, the oldest site on Niutoputapu, dating to just about 900 BC. So here we're picking up lapita in Polynesia proper, in Western Polynesia. This is the first stage of human settlement within the actual Polynesian triangle. The island of Futuna, which is between Samoa and Fiji, another Polynesian island. I worked there for my doctoral dissertation in 1974, and here I was finding material a little bit more recent in time, about maybe 200-300 BC. So now we're taking things a little bit closer in time. Still pottery, but no longer with any of that fancy decoration. It's just what we call plainware pottery. So you see what's happening in Polynesia was the pottery was gradually changing. People were getting less interested in making elaborate decorated pottery and now making simpler plainware pottery. They were probably elaborating their bark cloth, their tattooing, other kinds of arts, but the pottery is becoming less important. By the way, this adze is on exhibit in Pacific Hall, and some of this pottery you'll see there as well. If we go out to the Manua Islands in Samoa now, I'm drawing mostly on work that I've done just because it's easier to get the slides and so on. So this is work I did in the 80s, but others have done work in Tutuila and so on as well more recently. Now the pottery, we're looking at, around 2,000 years ago, it's just simple bowls. pottery has become, it's in its final stages. People are, just giving up the art. And it's very strange, sort of world history. We tend to think of material culture as always getting more sophisticated and advancing. So in China, we go from simple earthenware to then we go to more porcelains, and then finally we have, beautiful Ming and so on, porcelains and all this sort of stuff. But what was happening in Polynesia was it's going the other way. So the pottery is getting cruder and cruder and cruder. And finally, around 2,000 years ago, or maybe in the early first millennium AD, they just say, we don't care about this stuff anymore, and they stop making it. So the Polynesian ancestors had pottery, but around maybe 1,500 years ago, they gave it up completely. It's around that time, though. It doesn't mean that other aspects of their culture were becoming, less sophisticated. Quite the opposite. They just weren't interested in that pottery for some reason, right? But one of the things that they were doing was developing the technology of voyaging to its very high degree. And if you look at the distribution of canoes across the Pacific, it's quite clear that it must have been in this Tonga, Samoa, Fiji area that the double-hulled canoe was invented, probably something like 2,000 years ago, probably with all the voyaging back and forth between the Tonga, Samoa Islands and to Fiji, the perfection of all of this. So somebody gets the idea, let's replace that outrigger with another hull, and we lash them across, and what do we get? A catamaran, right? A double-hulled voyaging canoe. Then we put a house on top of the platform, and we put a couple of masts, big sails. Or what do we have? All of a sudden, we have the technology that could take 30, 40, 50, 60 people, pigs, dogs, chickens, planting stalks, coconuts, drinking water. We've got an instrument for exploration that, in fact, then took the Polynesians out to every island of remote Oceania, and in fact all the way to South America, as we now know. So the final stage then in this settlement is this expansion out of what we call the Polynesian homeland, the area of Tonga, Samoa, the Hawaiʻi that later is referred to in the Mo'olelo traditions, to all of the islands of what we call Eastern Polynesia, to the Marquesas, the Society Islands initially, and then out to eventually Rapa Nui, down to Aotearoa, up to Hawaii, which of course was named for the homeland Hawaiʻi. And this has been shown, of course, by many archaeological excavations, and much of it based here at the Bishop Museum. Come back again to Yoshi Sonoto. Here's Yoshi at the famous site of Vaituoti, and I just have to point out for those of you who know them, that's Muffet Jourdain there, and Tony Hahn behind there. Tony was here this morning. I go, Tony, that's you, in the picture. She goes, yeah, but I look different now. Okay. And the final stage then, of course, was, as I say, to the margins of the Pacific world. I don't have time today to go into all of the details of this, but there's a lot of recent evidence, I think in my view now, confirming that it was Polynesians in these double-hulled canoes who got all the way to the coast of South America, where, among other things, they picked up the sweet potato, the uala, or as it's known here in Hawaii, a very, very important crop later in Hawaii, in Aotearoa, in Rapa Nui, but we know to have been domesticated in the Andes of South America like 4,000, 5,000 years ago. So Polynesians get to the coast, and they probably said, oh boy, this is a hot desert area, coast of South America, people are warlike. Nah, we don't want to stay here. We'll go back to our nice islands. But we need something to eat, for the month voyage back. And uala, or sweet potato, was very much like the Polynesian true yam, the uhi, or ufi, which they had. So you can imagine this, that's like some kind of yam, just give us some baskets of that, and, we won't fight with you, we'll go back, we go home. They take this stuff, they bring it back into Polynesia. In a site called Tangata Tau on the island of Mangaia in 1989, I excavated carbonized pieces of sweet potato that could be identified as very distinctive under the microscope, and we dated those radiocarbon to around AD 1100, 1200. So, that ties down the introduction of the sweet potato. More recent work now suggests that Polynesians didn't just take the sweet potatoes, they dropped off the chicken. So this is still somewhat controversial, but the chicken has been found in sites, especially El Arenal in Chile, dated to pre-Columbian times. Several radiocarbon dates now. So there may have been even more than one interaction, more than one voyage back and forth. Okay, The last part of this talk, I'll try and wrap this up in the next 5-10 minutes. I wanted to talk about this issue of the changing dates for the settlement of East Polynesia, and especially for Hawaii, because I know a lot of you have wondered about that or asked about this question. So about, I guess in the early 80s, there began to be a sort of controversy debate amongst archaeologists. Most of this was just in the technical journals and so on, but about what we called the long versus the short chronologies for Eastern Polynesia, including Hawaii. And this article by Matthew Spriggs and Athol Anderson was a kind of provocative piece. They applied what they called chronometric hygiene, right? Like, your dental hygiene, brushing your teeth, flossing. They said, we need to apply some hygiene to radiocarbon dates. All the radiocarbon dates are messy, they said. Some of them, there was a laboratory in Japan, we used to use Gakushuin, and there were all kinds of questions about that lab. So they said, we're going to floss out all the Gakushuin dates. We don't want to use them. But there were other issues as well that were more important than just the Gakushuin one. There were advances being made in radiocarbon dating around this time, about 20 years ago, where the radiocarbon people moved from the older methods of gas proportional counting, were less accurate, to using these huge machines, what we call AMS dating now, accelerator mass spectrometry dating, where you take a linear accelerator and they accelerate this electron beam, and then the radiocarbon sample has been purified to pure carbon and mounted on a graphite little peg. And they shoot this electron beam into this graphite, and they literally blast off the atoms. They get sucked into a vacuum stream and then put into several mass spectrometers that actually count the numbers of atoms of C14, C12, C13. It's far more accurate and precise than the older method of radiocarbon dating. So instead of like Kenneth Emery, he got AD 1004 plus minus 180 years. That's a big plus minus. We're now getting like plus minus 30 years, okay? Far more precise. But also very, very important, we began to realize we needed to identify the charcoal that we wanted to date, right? In the old days, we just said, okay, charcoal, and I remember Yoshi or Kenneth said, get the biggest charcoal you can, it's the best stuff to date. It because what we were probably doing in many cases was dating driftwood from coastal sites. The Hawaiians or the Polynesians, they're camping South Point or wherever, nice big driftwood log. Okay, bro, let's cut them up, put them in the fireplace, sure. But if that log was redwood that drifted from the northwest coast around the North Pacific for 500 years before it washed up and was dated, the date will be accurate, but it's not dating when people burned the fire. So we realized, look, we need to identify the wood. We need to go after short-lived, shrubby things that were growing at the site at the time people made the hearth, okay? And we started doing that. It was a long process, it was expensive. You got to make reference collections and look at the charcoal under microscopes and all that. But what it meant is that we were eliminating the possibility of this old wood, okay? So those two things in particular are what have led to this revolution in dating over the last 20 years and this change from these much older dates to much younger dates for this last part of Polynesian settlement. So for example, Barry Roulette, my colleague up at the University of Hawaii in Manoa here, he worked in the Marquesas Islands where Suggs had worked and Sonoto had worked, and Sonoto said, it looks like AD 300, but Barry found this site on Tahuata, same kind of stratigraphy, same kind of early fish hooks that Yoshi had, but he couldn't get dates back past about AD 1025. And Barry was kind of scratching his head, why am I not getting AD 300? Well, he wasn't dating the old driftwood now, okay? And then, more recently, my French colleague from the French University of Tahiti, Eddie Comte, in 2009, he went back to the site of Hane that Sonoto had dug and re-excavated Hane. And now they have done AMS dating, identified wood species for Hane, same site, same layers that Yoshi dated. And these are the dates they're getting, 8900, 920, 1170, 1280, very much like Barry's dates from Tahuata. So, it wasn't that Yoshi did anything wrong. He just didn't have the right technology, dating technology. And now that we're revising, we've actually gone back and redated some of Yoshi's samples, and same thing is coming up. So the Marquesan chronology, and this is very important for Hawaii because we think the first people to Hawaii came from the Marquesas, right? So we can't have people in Hawaii at 8300 if the Marquesas aren't being settled to 8900. It doesn't quite work out. So the Marquesan chronology has been shortened. So this was Suggs in 1961. He thought it was the Marquesas. He actually said 150 BC. Sonoto revises it to 8300. Now we're more like, this was Susie Allen 2004 saying 8700, but it's probably more like 80,000. So the whole Marquesan sequence has been shortened in time. One other area I'll mention, the Mangareva Islands or the Gambier Islands in French Polynesia. They're farther down toward Rapa Nui. I've been working there in the 2000s. I made 4 expeditions there now. This site on the island of Taravai, by the way, Kenneth Emery was there in 1934, but he didn't realize he could dig. So he missed this site, lucky for me. At the site of Onimea, we have certainly within the first 100 years of Polynesian settlement, because there are tons of seabird bones right down at the interface of this, which is what you get when people first come on islands. They're big seabird rookeries. It's a real signal of initial human arrival. And we've excavated at Onimea some beautiful early Polynesian fishhooks, much like what Sonoto has from the Marquesas. And the radiocarbon date chronology now for Onimea, again, it's coming right in line with that from the Marquesas. Here's an example. There's one sort of earlier date you see here. This is one, unfortunately, we weren't able to identify it. It's too early. We say, okay, chronometric hygiene, we've got to throw that one out because it's probably driftwood. But we then dated a bunch of others, carefully identifying and on different kinds of material, and they're all falling pretty much within an envelope here, as you can see, between about 80,000 and slightly later. Okay, so the revised chronology for the eastern Polynesian core area, from which the first people to Hawaii almost certainly came, is now being revised to not much earlier than, let's say, 8,900, maybe 950, to around 1,000 or so. Now, if we turn then to Hawaii, is the last part here, what are we finding? Years ago, 1967, I was a Punahou student, actually, and I got to participate in this project that was directed by Richard Pearson up at UH Manoa. We excavated this site over in Waimanalo, sometimes called the Bellows Dune Site, or O18 in the Bishop Museum system. And it was a very interesting dune site. Unfortunately, nothing remains of it today. It later was mined by sand by the Air Force and destroyed. But the part that we did excavate in 67 had quite an array of artifacts that you see here. Fish hooks in pearl shell, some of them like this, very much like early Marquesan fish hooks. Adzes of a form that are, again, like early East Polynesian, not like later Hawaiian. And we thought it looked like an early site. And we got radiocarbon dates that seemed to be quite early. But again, we were in this time period, we weren't identifying the charcoal weight, kind of big error bars on these things. So, we said, well, maybe 8,600 to 1,100 for the Bellows site. That site has now actually been redated. Tom Dye got access to some of the original material we dug up in 67, and this shows the importance of curating these collections. They'd been saved here at the Bishop Museum, and he redated it with the new AMS method and got these range of dates you can see here. These were 3 different sets of dates, 1060, 1260, and 1310. And he uses what's called a Bayesian model of calibration. At any rate, Tom's conclusion is that the Bellows site was occupied sometime between 1040 and 1219. And this is, in my view, the oldest site that we know in the Hawaiian Islands, actual archaeological site with material that looks like early Marquesan and has been pretty firmly dated. And you see those dates again are falling quite well in line with what we have from the Marquesas, from Mangareva. There's a lot of consistency emerging now. But there's other lines of evidence we can use in Hawaii, and has been used for some time. When people come onto a remote oceanic island, when they first came onto these islands had seen no humans before. And people just in the activity of clearing gardens, these are people who are agriculturalists, bringing taro and yams and bananas, in getting food, in taking seabirds, other birds for food, and in bringing the little rat, the little Polynesian or Pacific rat that came with Polynesians everywhere. These inevitably caused changes in the local environment, and we can pick up these changes. They're what we sometimes call proxy signals of human arrival. And in Hawaii, we have quite a lot of this evidence now. One of the lines of evidence from Oahu is from pollen in cores in swamps, like over in Kawainui Swamp and up at Haleiwa. And it shows that around the lowlands of Oahu, when people first arrived, there were big forests of lolu palms, Pritchardia palms. They rapidly decline. That's the lolu here, and it's about 1200, and precipitously there's a decline. As you know, there are no lolu forests around the lowlands of Oahu today. Lolu is rare in the uplands. But the dating of that decline of the pollen, the lolu pollen, Steve Athens bracketed that sometime between AD 800. It cannot be any older than that, and not any later than AD 1200. Not terribly precise, but it's again falling into the same window that we're talking about with the Bellows site and so on. Then up on the island of Kauai, at the Makauwahi cave site, some of you may know of that or visited it. It's been worked on by Dave Burney and the late Pila Kikuchi. In this remarkable sinkhole, there was a trap for all kinds of birds, plants, animals, seeds, wood, everything. It's an amazing site. The deepest evidence for any humans being there is, again, the rat, which comes with humans on the voyaging canoes. And the deepest rat specimen from that cave has been radiocarbon dated. And here you have it, 1039 to 1241. Seem like a familiar time period again? Okay, we're falling again right into that same time period. And these little rats again, here's a picture that John Stokes took here at the Bishop Museum in 1917. The rat bones have also been found on the island of Oahu here out at Ewa, all the work that was done with the Deep Draft Harbor and all the extinct bird bones and so on found there. The rats appear in those sinkholes about, Athens claim, around AD 900. So you can radiocarbon date the bones of the little rats, even though we don't have the direct artifact evidence from people, but the rats came with people. We can date the rat bones. And so here are radiocarbon dates on some of the now extinct birds, but here is where the rats fall, AD again, 1000, 1200. And rats, once they're very fast reproducers. So, once they jump off the voyaging canoe on land, they're going to start reproducing fast, and you could get large numbers of rats, within a century all over the island. Okay, so just summarizes this. So a lot of evidence is now accumulating. The Bellows site, the pollen coring, the rat dating, some other evidence from Kauai I didn't talk about. These are the radiocarbon dates, and I think you can see that the evidence is really stacking up here for initial arrival of Polynesians in Hawaii around AD 1000. So I'm putting a date of, say, AD 1000, and we have to put a plus minus on it, perhaps 50 years. But I think this is now, a fairly strong case for this is when Polynesians arrived in Hawaii. What happened after that, of course, is a whole hugely interesting topic, the development of Hawaiian culture over 800 years to the magnificent culture that was here when Cook stumbled on the islands in 1778. It's a story I don't have time to tell, but maybe they'll invite me back some other time to give that talk. But that's the end of my talk for now, so mahalo nui loa for listening through, and if there's time, I'm happy to answer a question or two.
Mahalo for listening. If you have any questions or comments on this or other online audio programs, please visit us online at www.bishopmuseum.org. If you like us on Facebook, you'll be alerted when new programs are available. A hui hou from the Bishop Museum.